PET has been able to produce this event thanks to support from the British Fertility Society, London Egg Bank, Theramex, Reproduction and Fertility, which is an open access peer-reviewed journal from the Society for Reproduction. PET is holding this event today because it would have been Mary's birthday. She was born this day in 1924 as Helen Mary Wilson. She was the youngest of 7 children, and she was brought up by her mother and a nanny, as her father died shortly before she was born. And I often think this is quite an interesting fact about Mary, given the nature of assisted reproduction and arguments that we've had about donor conception over the years, that she knew who her father was, but had that lived experience of not actually knowing him in that way. Mary was a philosopher and a teacher, and had a long interest and expertise in education. In the 1980s, she was appointed to chair the Committee of Inquiry into Human Fertilisation and Embryology, and she then went on to become a member of the House of Lords. And Mary received one of the UK's highest honours when she was made a Companion of Honour in 2017, and she died aged 94 in March 2019. Testament to the impact she has had on public policy is the fact that more than 3 decades after she chaired the Committee of Inquiry into Human Fertilisation and Embryology, the UK still abides by its recommendations. This committee's 1984 report, often referred to simply as the Warnock Report, or sometimes just even Warnock, is the world's most influential analysis of the ethics of assisted conception and embryo research. And Mary became a patron of PET in 2010 and was a great support to us in our work. And I would like to share with you a letter that she wrote to us when she accepted. So, dear Sarah, thank you for your email and your kind invitation to become a patron of PET. I am honoured and delighted to accept. Now you have to imagine me in the PET office. I'm already overexcited because I've got a letter from the House of Lords with the envelope and all the rest of it. And then I read the first paragraph and I'm, Sandy, she said yes, amazing. And we were so thrilled because we couldn't think of anyone more appropriate to become our patron. And she went on to say, I have to admit that my interest in knowledge in the world of infertility treatment is now a bit diminished, partly because I'm out of date. But I am deeply interested in the possibilities of therapies derived from stem cell research, as well as in the whole field of genetic therapies. So I'd be very interested to hear more about the charity and would love to be associated with it. And she did support us from 2010 onwards. And she wrote these really fantastic words about us when we asked her to write something for a leaflet that we were putting out. I'm going to read it. The remarkable ability of the Progress Educational Trust to bring together experts from medical, ethical, legal and religious backgrounds, as well as its ability to anticipate key issues, ensures that the public and policymakers are kept up to date with ethical debate. As an independent body capable of drawing on all this expertise, PET has established itself as a provider of high quality, thorough and objective analysis. And this is something that she wrote herself. It's not something I ghost wrote for her to sign off on. So we couldn't have been more thrilled with that response from her. And I do feel incredibly fortunate to have got to know Mary just a little bit through my work at PET. And the highlight really has to be an afternoon that I spent in conversation with her, with Dr. Sue Avery, a former trustee of PET, and PET advisor Dr. Kirsty Horsey. I can only say the 3 of us were starstruck. It was a little bit like a blue stocking version of Loose Women or something. And we have a film of that discussion on our YouTube channel. And Sue Avery reflected on that meeting when she wrote an obituary in BioNews about Mary. And Mary received the Dan David Prize in 2018, a prize for research and achievements that have an outstanding scientific, technological, cultural or social impact on our world, and she received it for her leading role in the development of practical bioethics, specifically for her progressive and unparalleled contribution to the ethics of embryology and genetics. And Mary had to fly to Israel to collect the prize. She was in her 90s, and an extremely eminent professor in our field gallantly suggested that he wouldn't mind escorting her on the journey. I have to say it's an offer that she flatly but politely refused, joking to me that she wasn't going to start agreeing with him now, and she wasn't going to spend a flight to Israel and back trying to be persuaded. And that's a sort of one example of her wicked sense of humour. And when I chaired her at PET's annual conference in 2016, I asked her how she'd be like to be introduced and titled, because I'm never very certain about when you sort of call someone Baroness and when you call them Lady. I find it terribly confusing. And she said she really didn't mind what I called her at all, so long as I didn't call her Lady Mary. And I think that was a bit of a dig at Downton Abbey, which was, you know, incredibly popular at the time. And she also reminded me on that occasion that she was very hard of hearing and said I'd have to repeat the audience's questions to her, but added, please don't repeat the whole question because people talk for far too long. Just give me the gist of what they're trying to say and try to make them a bit more intelligible than they are, which caused me quite a wry smile too. And when she spoke at that conference, she did so for a full half an hour. She stood throughout, didn't have a single sip of water, and gave a great presentation, extremely impressive for somebody in their 90s. And afterwards, one of our volunteers, Daniel Mallin, booked her an Uber, and I can remember how thrilled he was to have that honour of booking an Uber for Mary Warnock. He was just absolutely beside himself. And you can read about that, well, about her presentation, not the Uber ride, in BioNews, and we'll be posting a link to that in chat too. And as a result of, I think, working with us, it did revive her interest in the fertility work that she'd said she'd sort of lost a bit in that letter. And she went on to record an interview with Roger Highfield for the Science Museum to celebrate the 40th birthday of Louise Brown, the world's first IVF baby. And as our chair of trustees, Professor Robin Lovell Badge wrote when she died, Mary was always determined that ignorance and prejudice should not be allowed to dictate the outcome of legislation. We still greatly miss her clear and level-headed thinking, her wisdom and common sense, and her unfailing support for the work of PET. Now, I'm not going to reflect on her achievements and the impact because we have 4 very eminent speakers lined up for you. We have Professor Emily Jackson, Professor Sarah Franklin, Peter Thompson, and Professor Alison Murdoch. Emily is Professor of Law at the LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and author of the book Medical Law Text, Cases and Materials, and she is former Deputy Chair of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. And in my view, I think she's one of the most knowledgeable people about the Warnock Report and the ensuing legislation.
I put some quotes from the Warnock Report on my slides because I think that sometimes you can really hear Mary Warnock's voice in them. What I'm going to argue is that the legacy of the Warnock Report is a regulatory system which has stood the test of time extraordinarily well and has proved to be both flexible and robust. At the same time, the world was a very, very different place in 1984, and there may be disadvantages in trying to regulate in the 21st century with tools designed for a very different age. So the Warnock Report addressed questions of morality, but its task was an essentially practical one. It had to come up with realistic proposals for regulation. The Warnock Report's view that professional self-regulation of fertility treatment was insufficient did not spring from nowhere. External oversight of the medical profession had been a key theme of government policy and of Ian Kennedy's 1980s Reith lectures. And Mary Warnock herself had argued separately, this quote here, that external oversight was necessary, importantly though not to restrict medical and scientific progress, but because it would allow scientists to get on with their work without the fear of private prosecution or disruption by those who object to what they're doing. So the best way to deflect calls for new technologies to be banned was to demonstrate instead that they could be controlled. So the Warnock report recommended the setting up of an arm's length body, independent of governments, with a lay chair and substantial lay representation. This body would have two functions essentially. It would issue licenses and inspect clinics and laboratories. It would also give advice to ministers and also to clinicians and scientists. It would have teeth because the sanctions for doing anything without a license would be very tough. And I think this regulatory model itself has proved to be remarkably resilient, serving as a template for other regulators, for example, for the Human Tissue Authority. So by allowing for regulation-making powers and the use of directions, and by giving responsibility for drawing up detailed guidance to the regulator through the Code of Practice, regulation has been able to respond to scientific, medical, social and legal developments. Just as an example, the Warnock report expressed a clear preference for donor anonymity. And as we know, regulations abolished anonymity in 2005. And for many years now, the HFEA Code of Practice has advised clinicians to encourage patients to be open with their children. While it was really important to build in this capacity for flexibility, and that I think was really central to the model, at the same time, the legislation was to have some lines that must not be crossed. And I love the last line from this quote from Warnock: "A society without moral scruples, and this nobody wants." This paradigm example of this line that must not be crossed is, of course, the 14-day limit for embryo research, which is a strict and absolute line in the statute. But interestingly, and I think relevantly to what I said earlier, in reality, it didn't impose a significant constraint upon scientists until several decades later, when it became feasible to keep an embryo in vitro and alive for 14 days. So just as we can't know what fertility treatment will look like in 2058, it was impossible in 1984 to predict what the provision of IVF services in the 2020s would look like. The Warnock report believed that it was really important that there should be a sufficient level of NHS provision for childless couples. And I think what the Warnock report didn't foresee is the development of a lucrative market in private fertility treatment. So the Act, which was based on Warnock, didn't give the HFEA any control over the prices that clinics charge, for example. Nor can the HFEA exercise very much control over non-regulated services, such as add-on treatments. And until relatively recently, the market for fertility treatments was limited to people who want to have a baby now and need assistance. New techniques such as social egg freezing can be marketed to a potentially vastly larger pool of people, any woman potentially who thinks that she might want to have a baby in the future. So in 1984, the Warnock report's main concern was unease at the apparently uncontrolled advance of science, rather than the apparently uncontrolled advance of advertising. So the HFEA's powers are focused on the need to prevent scientists from going too far, and it has rather less teeth when it comes to the marketing of for-profit services. So the preference that is expressed in the Warnock report for the heterosexual two-parent family now looks dated and judgmental. But I think at the same time, it's really important to acknowledge that it didn't recommend that there should be any statutory restriction on access to treatment. As it says here, hard and fast rules are not applicable. Similarly, on surrogacy, Warnock's recommendations were restrictive, but again stopped short of recommending a ban. So when we think about its representation of the family, I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that in the early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher had advocated, without any irony at all, a return to Victorian values. And the Thatcher government had introduced during the 1980s Section 28 of the Local Government Act, which provided that schools must not promote the teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. And that's a direct quote from the statute. So given that political backdrop, it could be argued that by not ruling out single women and same-sex couples from accessing fertility services or recommending that surrogacy should be banned, the Warnock report was relatively progressive. But of course, it's not surprising that issues have arisen that were simply not within the committee's contemplation in 1984. For example, trans parenthood, including in a recent case in which a trans man gave birth, and the courts have so far insisted that he must be registered on his son's birth certificate as essentially a male mother. It wouldn't have occurred to the Warnock Committee that a child's mother could be male. Nor is it surprising, and indeed I think it's to be celebrated, that attitudes towards the family have really changed beyond all recognition since the 1980s. Now, of course, the regulatory system is showing its age, and of course there are things that could usefully be changed. But actually, I think it's striking that legislation which has its roots in a report published in 1984 continues to be the basis of a flexible and responsive regulatory system nearly 4 decades later. It's unlikely to be a coincidence that the length of time the Warnock Committee was allowed to deliberate and its quite extraordinary collective expertise, in particular the contributions of Mary Warnock herself and of Anne McLaren, led to what have turned out to be really remarkably durable set of recommendations.
Sarah is director of the University of Cambridge's Reproductive Sociology Research Group, ReproSoc. She has authored a study of the legacy of Mary Warnock, and we're going to post a link to that in chat because it's open access, so people can take a look. And she's also the author of books including Biological Relatives, IVF, Stem Cells and the Future of Kinship. And I think I can't think of any more better place to talk about the impact of the Warnock report on society, and to give us some of the sort of human elements that she's discovered along through her research. Over to you now, Sarah.
It's a real honor to be able to talk about Mary Warnock in the company of such a distinguished group of people, but it's of course also extremely difficult to talk about Mary Warnock in such a short presentation. I'm really glad, Sarah, that you helped us capture some of her extraordinary wit and might I even say naughtiness, because yeah, we miss so many things about her. But I'd like today to talk about what I think is one of her most important legacies, which has come to be known as the Warnock Consensus. So this follows on very neatly from Emily's wonderful presentation. And it is also a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So hopefully we can pick up on anything I've covered too quickly in the question period. So we had the birth of Louise Brown in 1978, which was often described also as the birth of a legal vacuum, there being no legislative precedent for regulation in this area, which in turn led to the birth of the Warnock Committee, which was tasked with producing a basis for legislation in the usual committee of inquiry way in their cramped little offices in Elephant and Castle. And it's interesting that it was within a year of being formed that the committee had essentially agreed the foundation of their recommendations, the 14-day rule. This is, of course, a fascinating rule for so many reasons that I could have entitled this talk, The Special Status of the 14-Day Rule. And I'll be building on several of the points that Emily has also made about what makes this rule so special and why is the consensus it has enabled so distinctive. So one of the key features of the 14-day rule is that it is a limit, but it's also a social contract. It's based on the idea of exchange. And as Mary Warnock wrote in the report from the committee and afterwards, the 14-day rule expresses a reciprocity whereby in exchange for permitting IVF and embryo research, this field would be subject to the very strictest regulations overseen by a dedicated licensing authority. In that sense, the rule was both literal and symbolic. It was a very pragmatic, very literal rule. You couldn't go past 14 days. But the rule itself, as Emily has already indicated, was also itself a symbol. If IVF and embryo research are to be allowed, a firm line must be drawn past which the research can't go. The line has to be credible and enforceable. It must be clear, precise, pragmatic, and based on robust scientific evidence. And as a guarantor of the social contract, allowing such controversial research to proceed, this limit, in Mary's words, expresses the moral idea of society. So this law is what we might call expressive, an important role for many laws, but particularly for this one. So from this process, we might extract what we could call the Warnock principles. One of these was that it may not be possible, it won't be possible to decide what the special status of the embryo is in moral terms. But if it isn't possible to decide what's right in moral terms about the human embryo, which is unlikely ever to be the subject of complete consensual agreement, it must be, the limit must be, the law must be, the policy must be all right to the largest number of people. And although this could be interpreted as a utilitarian or a consensual form of morality, for Warnock, it was something more precise. It was, as she said, an expression of the moral status of society rather than the embryo. And it was also an expression of the power of the law. Any limit, as she said, is better than none, which nobody wants. Consensual limits do not need to be non-arbitrary to be effective, but they are more likely to win support if they don't appear entirely arbitrary. In this sense, limits are both literal and representative, and of course, according to this logic, limits can be changed. So this recipe, this formula for legislation has indeed been extremely successful. It's now endured for nearly 4 decades as an anchor of the unique system of governance in the UK. It's undergone a series, which has undergone a series of amendments and reenactments, most notably in 2008. The 14-day rule has been emulated by 14 other countries and has really served as the default global standard since 1990 for research in this field. It's been praised by legislators worldwide, and it's used as a textbook case for developing successful regulatory policy. It's helped to build public confidence in bioinnovation and to create the unique climate for translational science in the UK. As a result, this law and its accompanying regulatory infrastructure have come to be described by political scientists such as Sheila Jasanoff and Ingrid Metzler as the Warnock Consensus. And the Warnock Consensus is seen to be the reason the UK has not only an unusually strict and permissive legal environment, but also a high degree of stability, enabling, as they point out, a series of quite controversial biomedical translational technologies to be approved, formally approved. And they conclude that all of these innovations were subjected to extensive public consultation. Nevertheless, and perhaps precisely for this reason, none produced the public uproar or political deadlock that characterized comparable debates in Germany and the United States. Just to give a little bit more detail on this, in 2016, we were fortunate to discover a set of the Warnock files in Burnley that contained more complete documentation than we found previously, my research team. And these enabled us to look in a little bit more depth at the background to the formation of the Warnock consensus. I've written this up as an article, which, as Sarah said, will be put in the chat. It's open access, but I think we can say there's a basic principle underlying the Warnock consensus that emerges from these files, and it can be simply summarized as translational, that in order for biological, biomedical, bioscientific translation to be successful, that is to be translated into applications, it needs to be socially translated as well. And arguably, this is really what Mary Warnock and Anne McLaren did so well, both during the committee's work and afterwards, as the report was put through the subject of extensive parliamentary and public scrutiny. I just want to remind you a little bit of the kind of climate that Emily was describing in her paper, because this is the document from the meeting on November 9th, 1983, at which the 14-day rule was officially agreed by the committee. And the very first document on the table at that committee was called an analysis of correspondence received, giving the numbers of members of the public who had written in to the committee or parliament their views on IVF, embryo research, and other aspects of the report. And you can't really see the totals very well, but I can summarize them: that opposition to IVF and embryo research outnumbered support for it by a ratio of 50-1. 50 times as many people wrote to argue for some form of prohibition or ban on IVF or embryo research in comparison to the number of people who supported it. So they needed a very deliberate path to get through to a foundation for the law, and this is it. This is the diagram that was used on the 9th of November to reach the scientific basis, the biological basis for the 14-day rule. It's a diagram of the early stages of human development. It proceeds from the 2-cell to the 4-cell to the 6-cell to the 8-cell, etc. And it culminates in illustrations 10, 11, and 12, which all depict one stage of development from several different angles, namely the formation of the embryonic disc. And as you can see in this diagram, there is literally a line drawn where the embryo is meeting the placenta. And this was biologically the line that was proposed for the basis of the 14-day rule. However, it's very important to note that the basis for the 14-day rule was not purely a biological developmental argument. Warnock argued in an interview that we did with her in 2008 that once you regulatory line, you needed to have an additional justification. You couldn't just say there was a different kind of embryo before 14 days or 15 days. You couldn't just say that that in and of itself would be sufficient. There needed to be a combined rationale for 14 days that included, as she put it quite pragmatically, something which you could count on a calendar. It was no good having a developmental point by itself, she argued, because either some other scientist would come up and find another developmental point that was more important, or somebody might say, well, this is, is a late developing embryo or something, it would be disputable. Whereas days 1 to 14 could be marked off and you could just draw the line at that point. So once that crucial issue was solved, then we just stuck to the line and we knew that was what was going to go into the report. And the only dissenters in that, of course, were, as I say, the people who on religious grounds thought that the life of a human embryo was sacred from day naught. And yes, as people have noted, there were 3 dissenting voices in the Warnock report. So here's Mary in 2016 at the PET conference on this, where she, famously said that we shouldn't change the 14-day rule, but I'm going to suggest that in the wake of the research at Cambridge and other places which have shown the possibility of developing embryos further and the benefits that that would bring, that Mary probably would say we should change the 14-day rule, but only if we fully appreciate all of the reasons why it has been successful for so long. So thank you very much.
Now, next tonight, we have someone who most probably wouldn't have the job that he does if it weren't for Mary Warnock and the Warnock Report. And that's because it's Peter Thompson. And Peter is the Chief Executive of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority.
So I want to talk about Warnock and regulation. And I think the first thing to say, and perhaps most obviously, is that statutory bodies like the HFEA are, if you like, defined by their statute. So in our case, that's the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act of 1990. Those of you who know the detail will know that the Act was updated in 2008, but actually that left most of the sort of regulatory architecture untouched. So I think the 1990 Act is very much the touchstone for us. And what's striking about the 1990 Act actually is the extent to which it follows the recommendations of the Warnock Committee. So in many respects, the HFEA, by both its powers and frankly, what I want to argue, the way in which it goes about its work, is very much the product of Mary Warnock and the consensus that she managed to forge in 1984. And although Warnock is perhaps best known for its conclusions on topics like the 14-day rule, which both Emily and Sarah mentioned, similarly the importance of informed consent, the need for a register of treatments, and the right of donor-conceived people to find certain limit information out when they reach about their donor when they reach 18 years old, it's often forgotten, I think, that Warnock viewed regulation as the committee's chief concern. Last week, in preparing for this, I reread Warnock, which is always a delight in that, unlike most government documents, it's beautifully written. And I wanted to read a couple of passages out to you, the last one of which bears on something Emily said. But so here's a couple of quotes. It's the public concern about the techniques we have discussed needs to be reflected in public policy. We believe that all the techniques require active regulation and monitoring, even though, as we realise, such restrictions may be regarded by some as infringing clinical or academic freedom. It is not in our intention to interfere with the duty of the doctor to exercise clinical judgment in treating patients. Indeed, we accept and expect the doctor to be the person who makes the final decision about whether a treatment is likely to succeed and whether it should be used. Similarly, we accept that scientists must not be unduly restricted in pursuing their research interests, especially when this may produce direct therapeutic benefits. But doctors and scientists work within a moral and legal framework determined by society. They do not and should not depart radically from that framework. Our intention is that activities which have evolved in an unstructured and unmonitored way should be placed on a properly organised basis within a framework broadly acceptable to society. The interests of those directly concerned, as well as those of society in general, demand that certain legal and ethical safeguards should be applied. So it's clear then, isn't it, that Warnock regulation is a kind of bargain between science and society, what Sarah sort of referred to as a social contract, if you like. And warming to its theme, the report builds to its key conclusion. And I repeat something that Emily said. So the committee say, the protection of the public, which we see as the primary objective of regulation, demands the existence of an authority independent of government, health authorities, or research institutions. The authority should be specifically charged with the responsibility to regulate and monitor practice in relation to those sensitive areas which raise fundamental ethical questions. We therefore recommend the establishment of a new statutory licensing authority to regulate both research and those infertility services which we have recommended should be subject to control. And this is effectively what the report builds to. And the HFEA, the body I'm currently chief executive of, is in fact the kind of independent licensing body envisaged by Warnock. So we license both treatment and research. We inspect licensed premises and research projects. We hold a register of treatments. We issue guidance to the fertility sector in the form of a code of practice, which is regularly updated. And we provide information and advice to clinic staff, patients, government ministers, and the wider public. All of these functions were envisaged by Warnock. And because so much of the statute actually reflects the recommendations of the Warnock Committee, we are in effect regulating against many of their conclusions. And the clarity which comes from the approach that Sarah set out, this idea of making dividing lines, if you like, on, say, the 14-day rule, certainly makes our job, the regulatory task, very much easier. And again, I think Sarah made this point very, very well. There is no dispute on whether an embryo is or is not 14 days old. Were we to try to regulate against a developmental test, that would be fraught with difficulty and subject to challenge. So, you know, as a regulator, one of the beauties of the Warnock conclusions is the extent to which such, you know, sophisticated thinking was brought to bear on entirely practical solutions. I think Warnock also influences the way in which the HFEA over the years has gone about its regulatory and policy making business. So the authority itself is composed of a mix of what the Act is terms lay and professional people, much like the original committee. The aim, as before, was to ensure that our decision making is informed by expert opinion, but not dominated by it. And I think a lot of our regulatory credibility with the wider public comes from striking that balance. And like Warnock, I think the HFEA makes regulatory policy in a pragmatic manner, for want of a better term, building consensus where possible, recognizing that we can't please everyone all the time. Like Warnock, we tend to proceed by drawing lines on issues, whether a donor should receive financial compensation, for example. So I make absolutely no claim that we have chosen the right figure, or even that there is actually such a figure. But it would be impossible to regulate against the idea that donors should be recompensed so long as it didn't amount to an incentive. That effectively is underpinning broad ethical argument. And I think lots of us understand that, but it's not a practical basis on which to regulate. You know, we need a particular sum of money. Indeed, I would go so far to say it's precisely by drawing regulatory lines that we can revisit them, as Sarah suggested, to take into account of developments over time, whether they're scientific, clinical, or social. Arguably, it's Mary Warnock who gave us that way of working. I think, again, picking up on what Emily said, the regulatory scheme, which was set out and outlined by Warnock, has stood the test of time remarkably well. Much of it is still fit for purpose. But again, as others have said, it would be pretty unusual if it wasn't showing its age in one or two places. And here, actually, I don't want to focus on things like the 14-day rule or some other policy position, because I think it's the regulatory architecture itself where Warnock is, in fact, most in need of a fresh look. Here, I'm really touching on Emily's point about effectively what we're trying to do now is regulate a market, a modern market. So thinking on regulation itself has actually involved an awful long way in the recent years. So Warnock's got a great deal to say about the status of the embryo, but it's actually pretty silent on the patient or the quality of care they receive. The HFEA Act requires us to inspect as the principal means of establishing clinic compliance. But in other fields, we see the introduction of near real-time performance data, for example, or the use of enforcement mechanisms like fines as a means of encouraging good practice. And one of the ways in which new technologies have been regulated in other sectors is through trial approvals where a single user can offer a service for a specified period of time before the regulator considers wider introduction. None of those regulatory options are available under the HFEA Act. But all that's for the future. This year we celebrate the HFEA's 30th anniversary. The fact that we and the regulatory scheme is in such good shape is a remarkable legacy of a remarkable woman.
Alison Murdoch is a Professor of Reproductive Medicine at Newcastle University, and she is the former head of Newcastle Fertility Centre and a former chair of the British Fertility Society. And in fact, she was the first woman to hold that post. She's a trailblazer.
I've been asked to talk specifically about, from a clinical point of view, reproduction has always been a battlefield between individuals who want to respond to their basic reproductive instincts, but to society think they actually know what's better for them. So the task that faced Mary Warnock was really very daunting, and I think it's a testament to both her wisdom and the pragmatic views that the resulting consensus report provided a framework that has been of benefit to patients, clinicians, and scientists for so many years. I think it's sad that the measured approach that was adopted by the committee wasn't totally reflected in the following political debate. So the Act in 1990 actually wasn't a full implementation of her recommendations. Nonetheless, there were three important principles that I think have proved over the last 40 years to be of benefit to the clinical service. The first was the fundamental thing that IVF was right, and this provided legal protection both for patients and for service providers. The second was that the legitimacy of children who were conceived following the use of donated gametes and IVF was defined in law, and the hole that we were worried about previously. This has protected children and assigned appropriate legal and parental responsibility, which was very much needed. And then thirdly, Warnock recommended that embryo research should be permitted. I'm not going to say a lot about research, but it would have been completely illogical to permit IVF clinically, but at the same time prohibit research that would actually improve the outcome. And again, this has been a benefit to patients, clinicians, and scientists. But I don't think we can applaud the Warnock report without noting the recommendations that weren't translated into legislation, and specifically the failure to create the nationally coordinated NHS-based service that they wanted. It was totally ignored in the legislation then and by subsequent governments. This failure has resulted in the dominant private IVF market and has left many couples childless simply because they can't afford to pay. It's completely contrary to the principles of the NHS. I mean, it's a blight on the UK's claim that it provides universal access to healthcare. As Peter says, the HFEA is currently lobbying for the power to curb costs of private treatment and prevent selling some procedures that have no benefit. But really, there's only one solution to this problem, and that's to make IVF a core service within the NHS and let the private sector option only be for those who decide they want to choose to pay. Having watched over the flourishing private IVF market and the consequences, I think the HFEA are fully aware of the harm that this does to patients. Warnock recommended the establishment of a working group at national level whose first task would be to consider how the best IVF service could be organised within the NHS, and it didn't happen. The government and the HFEA now blame the lack of NHS provision on local decisions, but actually I don't think Mary Warnock would have accepted that excuse. So in looking now at the question about a review of the Act, I think it's very timely, but it does need more than just a little bit of adjustment. Why is that? Because if you think about the remit of the Warnock Committee, that was 40 years ago, and things have changed now beyond recognition. Legislation that followed the report reflected the situation in the 80s, and that has not really changed at all. There are so many problems that are in the Act now that need putting right. I can't go through them all, but I just want to give you three examples that I think might illustrate it. The first is the register. Now, Warnock recommended that sperm donors should be used for no more than 10 children, and that to regulate this, the national register would be set up so that donors could be monitored. There was also consideration for holding a central register of all children born as of IVF, but despite this, this is despite their understanding that this was actually going to be associated with lots of ethical considerations. But the subsequent legislation results in that identifying information about those who've had IVF treatment has to be held on the HFEA database. And this includes couples who've used their own gametes and may never have had a child. There is absolutely no justification for keeping this data, and it's costly in time and money to collect and maintain the database. The BFS and the ACE publication in 2013, and that drafted very detailed proposals for the revision of the register that would be consistent with Warnock and would be cost saving. They were reviewed by the McCracken report in 2013, accepted, and HFEA action was recommended, but subsequently no significant changes had been made. It's interesting that under the Data Action Act in 2018, sensitive health data must be strictly necessary, and there must be specific and legitimate reason for collecting and processing personal information. So maybe it's going to take a legal challenge from a patient before it's going to be able to force this change. And then the third role I want to talk about is the role of professionals. As mentioned, the Warnock report described the clinical activities at the time as being unstructured and unmonitored and needing to be properly organized. And actually, that was a statement of fact. It wasn't a criticism, it was just how it was then. But it is also relevant to note the background at that time. Very little was known about the science of human implantation embryology. There'd only been a few hundred IVF treatments. Its role was still controversial even within the profession, and there were no clinical embryologists. So there were no established clinical or laboratory standards, and there were almost no learned publications. But in 2021, the BFS is a very large multidisciplinary society. ARCS is a society for professional clinical embryologists, numerous worldwide learned societies linked by the International Federation of Fertility Societies. There are several high impact journals dedicated to reproductive medicine. Professional groups have now researched and audited and published ARC documents, and standards of care are well documented. NICE has made recommendations about the provision of fertility services. So I think from a professional perspective, this really is now properly organised. The Warnock Committee recommended that the advisory role of the authority would be to issue general guidance to those working in the field on good practice and infertility service provision, and to offer advice to government. And that is, as Peter said, one of the HFEA's current activity. But actually its function is, that function is compromised by the legal requirement for the authority to be dominated by those who are not actually involved with the provision of treatments. So when they're determining their good practice guidelines, the choices for the HFEA are that they either repeat professional standards that are published elsewhere, or they provide conflicting advice. And neither of these are really constructed functions. We might speculate that if a Warnock review were concluded, were convened now, that might say that the executive function of the authority should remain, but its advisory role is redundant in 2021. And then the third and final issue is actually much more difficult to discuss in bullet points. Mary Warnock talks about public anxiety many times, but the source of this perceived public anxiety is really not given, and it's not clear. There were clearly a lot of very challenging academic discussions, and maybe a presumption was that everybody in general had the same views and concerns. It also is worrying a little bit, though, that public anxiety is sometimes used now to justify political decisions, so we need to be wary about that. But do we have evidence of public anxiety in 2021? Now, when we recently needed a parliamentary debate and regulatory change about mitochondrial transfer procedures, we engaged in quite a long, prolonged public debate, focus groups, media discussions, and a consistent feature was that when procedures were explained and the clinical indications were explained, there was pretty universal understanding and public support. And this was subsequently reflected in the very large affirmative votes in the House of Parliament and legislative approval. I think it does seem that the public are actually quite capable of the moral reasoning that Warnock attributed to her committee's recommendations. As Peter said, Warnock also stated that the protection of the public was the primary objective of regulation. But in relation to IVF, what harm are the public being protected from in relation to IVF? Are you harmed if your neighbour has a baby by IVF rather than natural conception? And maybe that wasn't really what Warnock was concerned about, but it's not defined. Regulation now is primarily related to patient protection, but unlike the situation in the 1980s when Warnock was reporting, it's routine now that professionals and healthcare regulators are there to assure standards of care, data collection and audit, accountability of service providers, and the probity for public finance. IVF is now an accepted and effective clinical treatment that's provided with a very tightly regulated healthcare structure in 2021. And Warnock review now might reconsider the need for additional regulation. So in conclusion then, I would definitely applaud Mary Warnock and a committee for the resulting legislation in 1990 and accept that it was fit for the purpose then. But in 2021, I think we have a completely different world, and that act is no longer fit for purpose. It's a generation out of date. I do understand the reluctance to reopen the act in Parliament, given the reproductive battlefield that I stated earlier. Nonetheless, I think 40 years is too long. And I think maybe an option we should consider is to do what the politicians did in 1980, which is to get an independent committee to give advice on what should happen, hence Warnock. I think such a review could look at each clause in the Act and say why, what's the justification. Some clauses will be retained, some redacted completely, and others may be redacted to meet the social and legal circumstances in 2021. So maybe we need a new Mary Warnock.
Before we go to the questions tonight, we're going to hold a poll, and the question that we're going to ask follows on beautifully, and it wasn't planned in this way, from Alison's final point. Do you think that there needs to be a new committee of inquiry, similar to the Warnock Committee, assessing the ethics and law of human fertilisation and embryology authority? And I'm going to launch that poll now, and give you a chance to answer. Your answers will be anonymous, and I will share the results once we've tackled the first question. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee, and they say that both Peter and Emily have brought up how the fertility sector has developed as a market in ways that the Warnock report didn't anticipate. And they ask the question, should the HFEA's remit be amended in this regard, or is it really the place of other bodies such as the CMA, which is the Competition and Markets Authority? So I'll put that first to Emily, and then we'll come to Peter.
So yes, I think it would be much better if the HFEA had powers to control things that at the moment it doesn't really have powers to control. So an obvious example is the sale to patients of non-evidence-based additional therapies, which the HFEA has very, very limited powers over. And I don't think it's just the Competition and Markets Authority issue. I think it's the fact that what the legislation contains is really, really strict lines about what you can do to embryos and gametes outside of a woman's body. It doesn't pay attention to issues around advertising, marketing, what you do, which doesn't involve embryos and gametes outside of a woman's body. So giving a woman reproductive immunology pills, which might be dangerous and might not work, is not something that the HFEA has very many powers over. So yes, I would actually say there needs to be some power in the regulator's armory. It's not just a CMA issue.
Peter, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would agree with Emily, and we do feel as if we don't have the kind of range of powers that would be most suitable here. The CMA, for those of the sort of those people looking in, effectively, this is the CMA have powers to enforce UK consumer protection law. So these are not laws necessarily about so-called add-ons per se. They are simply around the sorts of terms and conditions that one gets when one is a consumer. They've applied this sort of policy to things like care homes, university education. So it's not just simple markets. It might, you know, it's a question about what kind of information up front does the patient have, in this case, if you're buying medicine, as such that you are making a clearly informed decision. That goes some way to helping with these kind of issues, but in itself, it doesn't solve it. So we certainly think it would be helpful to have some additional powers, and as others have said before, you know, this was just not a feature of IVF provision when Warnock and indeed the law was brought into being.
I don't know whether Sarah or Alison wants to come in on this one.
I think I would just repeat what I said before, really, that the only real solution to the big problem with private IVF market is to make it in the NHS. My concern a little bit is that I actually do not understand clearly what powers the HFEA would have that would make a significant dent in the problem, because I think you have to remember that the vast majority of the private market is there to make money, not to provide a service. They're not saying they don't provide a good service, but the reason data is different. And so really the only solution to this is to get IVF back into the NHS, not back into and anyway.
Yes, I think, you know, obviously an NHS provision of fertility services is something I've been very passionate about and campaigned about over the years. And it is so disheartening that, you know, this is not happening in it when it's happening so well in Scotland, and we see, you know, a much smaller private market in Scotland in comparison as a result, and that the add-ons issue is a bit of a non-issue when we do events in Scotland as a result of that. But before when people want to hear my views, I'm going to end the polling now, and I'm going to share the results with you all. And as you can see, 81% of you do think that there should be a new committee of inquiry similar to the Warnock Committee. So I'm going to stop sharing that and then go to the panel and say, do you agree with that? What do you think that this should be set up in the next sort of 12 to 18 months? And because Sarah hasn't responded to that last question, I'll go to her first, actually.
Thanks for that really simple question. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, this is a common question that depends in part, you know, what kind of new committee it would be and to what extent the existing infrastructure would remain and be subject to a sort of review versus a kind of wholesale start over job. And therefore, I think the answer to the question depends an awful lot on what the brief for that committee would be. And it couldn't simply be to start from a blank slate, given the lengthy and complex legislative and regulatory landscape that is so distinctive here. So it would have to be sort of some hybrid of introducing new elements, which could be, as Alison suggested, going through and taking each clause by clause. But as the questions about the market suggest, there are quite profound moral issues underlying many of those clauses that didn't exist at the time. So it would really be a huge, huge job. I'd just like to maybe say one quick thing about the marketing, which is that Warnock did have extremely strong views about the surrogacy market. In fact, really quite dramatically extreme views on that. And, you know, there is a piece of research to be done, I think, around Thatcher, Warnock, the promotion of the fertility sector by the Thatcher government as a paradigm for private healthcare, and the view of the Warnock Committee that marketing of surrogacy had to be banned. So yeah, it's a complicated story, and it certainly hasn't gotten less so.
Okay, I'm going to go next to Peter and then to Emily on this one.
Just because your poll was so heavily one way or the other, let me put a counter view. And I say this just because if people want relatively speedy change, a committee, an expert commission is not the way to go about it. You know, Warnock, as we know, took 2 years. There was then a number of other years before legislation even found its place. You know, there's a kind of sense in which if, for example, people are of the view that the Act is really showing its age, it will, you know, you're probably looking at, you know, 5 years plus before you might be anywhere near Parliament. So I think, you know, there are cautions here, and there's a danger in just replicating the process that worked before because it works so well. There's no guarantee doing it again in a similar way would get the same, you know, marvelous outcome in a way, because plenty of expert commissions have actually not delivered a long-lasting, profound settlement. You know, I think people should just be careful about assuming that running the same process is the answer to our prayers here. My sense is, because we already have a long-standing regulatory framework in law, that actually one could do a serious look at it and modernization of it, if you like, without necessarily going down the expert commission route.
Yes, and it's certainly true. Before I go to anything, you know, that Margot Brazier did a report on surrogacy, recommending reform, and that has sat and gathered dust. We are getting there slowly with surrogacy reform, but it's not, unfortunately, as a result of her report many years ago. Emily, do you want to come in on this?
Not really got anything to add. I think there would obviously be some advantages to starting with this paper and thinking, what do you think regulation should look like in for the coming 20 years, rather than trying to tinker at the edges. At the same time, I think Peter's point is a really important one, that there's a real danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that there is a regulatory system which generally works well. And be careful what you wish for in terms of what you might get if you open it all up.
And Alison, have you got something to add?
I would just say that I think if we're setting up again, it would not be the same as the Warnock report in terms of its terms of reference. The advantage of having a separate report, the problem with the Act is that so far what's happened is we've just really papered over cracks, and I think you can paper over cracks for a certain limited point of time, but eventually the house falls down. And if it does take a long time to change, then I think we have to do that. And I'm not saying, you know, start right from the beginning, but actually look arguably at all the clauses carefully and make them fit for purpose now. A lot of the discussion of a lot of the speakers so far, we've talked about the 14-day rule, the things that are new in terms of research, but the majority of what the authority is doing and what the Act covers is actually standard routine clinical procedure. And that's where things need to change.
Yes, I think there is always a danger, and you see this with any piece of legislation, that it's always much easier just to add a bit on and never take any out, and so it just grows and grows and grows and becomes extremely complicated, a bit like terms and conditions on the back of a contract. They never knock any out there. It's sort of just mushrooms. Now there's a comment from Martin Johnson about, by the way, I think, you know, Sarah should chair the Warnock committee, a new Warnock committee. So I think Sarah Franklin and I will take that as a joint chair, because I think it would take 2 people to do the work of Mary, yeah, I'm not quite sure which one of us is mean, but I'm pretty confident he means Sarah Franklin. Now, the next question, the most popular question, and I'm a little bit confused about this, but I'm going to put it anyway because the person might want to clarify. It's Elaine O'Callaghan, and she says, what does the panel think of the Law Commission proposal to allow children to access identifying information at 18 years old? Would Warnock likely agree with this, or expect progress perhaps to recognising children's need to access this at a younger age? So it's not the Law Commission's decision, this. This is actually something different. So I think if Emily or Peter speak first about what the actual law is around this, and then I'll get the others to come in. So Emily or Peter, who wants to
The
go?
children can already get identifying information at the age of 18. And as I mentioned, the Warnock report itself was against that. It was in favour of anonymity, but obviously that was in 1984, and the world has clearly moved on from then. And I assume a new commission would not want to read that and make donors anonymous again.
And I know, Peter, that obviously the authority is gearing up to the opening of the register for people wanting to access that information.
Well, Emily's quite right. It's already open, so to speak. The difference is that it's in 2023 is the years on from the removal of anonymity. So what we're expecting is just, greater numbers. And I think if you combine that with a social atmosphere where there's much more discussion about all this, and programs on TV and the like, I suspect, and an awful lot of stuff on social media, that so the task for us really is moving from a system where, frankly, the numbers of applicants are relatively modest into one where actually this could be a really quite significant part of our day-to-day operational business.
Do either Sarah or Alison want to come in, or shall I move on to the next one? I'm conscious I've got quite a few questions now after a slow start. So the next one is from an anonymous attendee who's talking about the paucity of NHS funding, and says, wants to say how can it be justified in a universal health system that the minority of people really get treated on the NHS? And they say, should the HFEA have legal power to compel CCGs, whatever they morph into next? Because sometimes we've been around the block with, there were primary care trusts and other things before that, to fund the NICE recommended 3 IVF treatment cycles. So, Peter, do you want those powers to be able to compel CCGs? I want you to.
Whether we wanted them or not, we won't get them. The fundamental point here is, I think it is, I don't know whether it's the only service that has such patchy provision, but it's undoubtedly true that the provision of NHS services in England far short of the NICE guidelines in a way that is highly unusual elsewhere, and I think that's entirely retrograde. However, the broad commissioning assumption is that either services, very few services, are commissioned nationally in England, or they are local decisions. Fertility services are local decisions. So unless there is a bigger decision made by NHS England and or ministers to make this a national commission decision, it will be commissioned locally. And there's certainly not going to be any call to give the HFEA powers to compel local commissioners, because you can imagine what sort of questions that would raise more generally about a local commissioning.
Alison, I think you might want to come in on this.
Yes, I would say is that one of the roles the HFEA has is to advise government, and if the HFEA has the evidence that shows that patients are harmed by lack of availability or the cost of going through the private sector, I don't know whether the HFEA, without my knowing about it, has actually fed that information back. So might not have the power to actually arrange the funding, but you perhaps do have the authority to pass the information about the detrimental effect of the lack of NHS services back to the department.
Well, more importantly, to NHS England.
Well, just to add on that, my strong sense is, MPs of all parties get lots of letters about this, and ministers I think ministers are very aware of the particular circumstances as they affect at the moment and their impact on patients.
Okay, I'm going to move on from funding, as I could talk about it all evening, to the next question, which is about the 14-day rule, and it's an anonymous attendee. They say the 14-day rule has been extremely influential globally. Did other countries have an equivalent of the Warnock report, or did it happen in the UK? Because this is where the first IVF baby was born, and the others followed suit. And I want to add a supplementary question from Anna Louise Sussman on this, about How does the US get a Warnock report, or a Warnock-ish, she says, commission, or any public debate on these questions? So perhaps we'll go to Sarah Franklin on this one first, and she can have a go at both of those.
Okay, so I mean, I think the short answer to the first question is no. There haven't been any other countries that have had as extensive consideration, nor are there any which have established so comprehensive a legislation, nor such daring one. So it is exceptional. The UK, in terms of the US, which has a patchwork of state by state regulations and no record whatsoever of successful federal legislation in this area, it's highly unlikely it would ever be possible due simply to the influence of the religious right over the question of abortion, which of course has produced the global gag rule amongst many other very unfortunate consequences. And therefore, the United States would probably be quite low on the list of places one would expect anything like this in the future. But whether the other question of what kind of future legislation emerges around this, or around CRISPR, or around blastoids, introduces, say, for example, a more international set of agreements, there you might see a Warnock 2.0 that was not a national regulatory system, but a more bespoke and perhaps even area specific regulatory system, such as the kind of quasi-regulatory agreement that has surrounded CRISPR.
Do any of the panelists want to come in on this, or shall I move on to the next question? So this is from Lucy van der Wiel, and this touches on abortion as well. And she says, I remember Mary Warnock reflected on the risks of revising the 14-day rule in relation to the potential backlash coming from anti-abortion sentiments. And I was wondering if the panelists share this concern, and whether they could reflect on the relationship between regulation and the politics of IVF and abortion, because that's one of always the big things in ministerial, in parliamentary circles, is opening the act, abortion, shock horror. So I don't know who wants to come in on that first. Perhaps we'll go to Emily first on that.
Yeah, so the 1990 Act reformed the Abortion Act and introduced some changes to introduce the 24-week limit, for example. And one could see why that was done, because it was a piece of legislation going through Parliament and amendments were added to it. But the result of that decision was, exactly as Sarah has said, a real fear that any time you open up the Act, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, you're opening up abortion as well. It was such a dominant theme in 2008, the fear that if we were to, if you go there, if you go into this piece of legislation, there's a real danger of threatening the provision of abortion. But I think maybe we could be a bit more confident today than they were in 2008, just because of the extraordinary changes there have been recently in relation to abortion in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland, that maybe maybe I'm wrong about this, but that maybe things have moved on, and actually the idea that you would significantly restrict women's access to abortion maybe is an idea that's time has passed, but who knows.
Does anybody want to come in next? Alison?
Yeah, well, I share what Emily was saying, and it is an anomaly that the abortion issue is tied into the Act. But in terms of the question about regulation and oversight of abortion and IVF, we wrote a paper quite a few years ago now where we went through the Abortion Act and the HFEA Act and actually looked at the comparison with not just what the acts say, because basically they are both permissive acts with limitations, both to do with reproduction, but obviously with completely different aims and background, but also the regulation that goes with it, which is completely different. It is an anomaly, and I think it's one of those things that actually, in reviewing the Act, going back to square one, perhaps might be able to be sorted out.
Great. I'm very conscious that we're running out of time now, and I'm going to take this final question. I think it's something that the panel might all agree with, actually. So it was a question for Alison about public anxiety, but actually saying, should we be more worried about press sensationalism? Headlines about a favourite term, designer babies, show no signs of going away even after sensible debates about legalising mitochondrial donation. Alison, you've been in the media a lot, for good and bad. I'll let you go on that one first.
The question about the media and how the media deal with the thing is, you have to understand what the press is about. The press is there to sell their media and to sell those, and they will use whatever means are available to do that. And that is often to the detriment of some of the things that we actually want to do. I just worry that the idea that this is public anxiety is just a cover and a blanket to allow people to do things, to allow politicians to do things that don't have any other justification. So I think we just need to be, who are the public? Who are we talking about? If you can't actually see them directly and get the view, their informed view, then I think you have to be just a bit skeptical about what it means.
Do any of you at the rest come in on this for your final word for the evening? Peter.
Let me offer a slightly cautionary tale. I think there is a terrible tendency for people to adopt what used to be known as the Whig view of history, which is that gradually over time, views get more and more liberal. I would have thought the events of recent years would suggest to us that each generation doesn't automatically build on the sort of liberal shoulders of the predecessor. These things have to be negotiated time and again, and I wouldn't presume one way or the other that the public attitudes are moving in a particular way.